Before empires, before kings, the earth slept beneath a sky of thunder. And in the darkness, gods whispered to the storm. The heavens roared, mountains cracked under their fury, lightning carved its name across the heavens, and from chaos, the world was born. The Bronze Age had begun. From fire, man forged his destiny. Bronze, the gift of gods and the weapon of kings. With every hammer's strike, the darkness drew back, and the world learned what power truly meant. They built walls to defy the storm, and blades to claim the will of heaven. Cities rose from dust, gleaming like molten suns. The gods watched and smiled. From thunder came order, from fire came empire, and from men who dared to challenge the sky came the Hittites, forged in bronze and crowned by storm. Empires. Historical welcomes you. Subscribe now and witness how the storms of history shape the world we live in today. 3,000 years ago, before iron was mastered and steel had a name, the world trembled beneath the weight of gods and kings. Lightning was not yet science, it was a weapon in the hands of the divine. Empires clashed not only for land, but for the favor of their gods, for the right to exist under heaven. In that age, every sunrise could be the dawn of glory, or the final light before annihilation. It was the age of bronze, when power was forged in molten metal and ambition was written in blood. The land of Egypt flourished along the Nile, where pharaohs claimed to be gods in flesh, and monuments of stone rose high enough to touch eternity. To the east, in Mesopotamia, Babylon sang hymns to its towering ziggurats, while Assyria's armies marched with ruthless precision. Across the sea, the Mycenaean kings of Greece ruled behind walls so thick they were said to be built by giants. And in the heart of Anatolia, hidden among windswept mountains and valleys of red earth, there stirred another power, one that time itself would almost erase. Few today remember its name. For centuries it existed only as a whisper in the pages of the Bible, the sons of Heth. Scholars dismissed it as myth, a fragment of scripture lost to history. But long before Rome was founded, before even Athens had drawn its first breath, this forgotten empire ruled the crossroads of the ancient world. Its warriors drove chariots with the thunder of storms. Its kings commanded through fear and faith, and its gods numbered in the thousands. This was not Egypt, nor Babylon, nor Greece. This was something else, something both terrifying and magnificent. And yet, they vanished. Entire cities swallowed by earth, names erased from stone. An empire that had once challenged pharaohs simply ceased to exist. No chronicler remained to tell their story. No song remembered their victories. Only silence and the dust of Anatolia kept their secrets. For more than 3 millennia, the world forgot that they had ever lived. Until one day, a traveler wandering among the ruins of Turkey stumbled upon colossal gates carved with lions and gods with wings of stone. The inscriptions were unlike any language known to man, and beneath the weight of centuries, history stirred once more. Empires. Historical welcomes you. Tonight, you and I will travel back to the dawn of power, to the era when man first believed he could stand beside gods. We will uncover the mystery of the empire that rose from nowhere, ruled half the known world, and vanished without a trace. Who were these people? What god did they serve? What secret buried beneath their fall still echoes in the fate of nations today? Stay with me, because what you are about to hear will change how you see ancient history forever. Imagine the world as it was then, bronze glimmering like firelight, the scent of iron yet unknown. This was not an age of peace. It was a time when survival itself was divine will. Empires were living creatures. They breathed, hungered, and killed to stay alive. Armies marched beneath banners of gods. Horus in Egypt, Marduk in Babylon, Zeus unborn in the West. Each ruler believed his kingdom was eternal, ordained by the heavens. But eternity is a fragile thing. Every civilization carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. And in that violent balance between creation and collapse, one power briefly burned brighter than them all. Its capital was a fortress city carved into living rock, its temples filled with the echo of prayers in a language the world would not understand again for 3,000 years. Its kings called themselves beloved of the storm god. Its people believed the thunder itself protected their walls. When they rode to war, their chariots did not creak. They roared, drawn by horses trained in secret ways lost to modern man. To their enemies, they were not merely soldiers. They were a tempest made flesh. But history is cruel. The higher a civilization climbs, the greater the fall awaiting it. In the end, even the gods seemed to turn their faces away. Famine struck. The seas filled with marauders. Earthquakes shattered the great citadels of the Bronze Age, and in the chaos, this mighty empire, this land of the 1,000 gods, was swept away as if it had never been. For centuries, no one knew why. Some said they angered their deities. Others claimed they were devoured by the very storms they worshipped. Only fragments survived. Tablets buried beneath ruins, shards of pottery that once told of kings and queens who spoke to thunder. When archaeologists first uncovered their remains, they could not read their language. The letters carved into clay looked familiar, yet alien. Babylonian? No. Assyrian? Not quite. It was only in 1915 when a Czech scholar in the middle of a world war read a simple line, "They eat bread and drink water," that the truth dawned. This was the earliest Indo-European tongue ever written. The voice of a people who had vanished from the earth had spoken again, and with it, a forgotten empire rose from silence. Their story is one of brilliance and blood, of law and chaos, of faith so deep it blurred the line between human and divine. It is a tale of kings who saw themselves as gods, and gods who acted with the flaws of men. It is the story of the Hittites, the empire that stood beside Egypt as its equal, that sacked Babylon, that fought the greatest battle of the ancient world at Kadesh, and that wrote humanity's first peace treaty long before the word civilization had meaning. For centuries, historians called Egypt eternal, Babylon glorious, Greece enlightened. But the Hittites, they were the storm between them. Their rise was as sudden as lightning, their fall as devastating as thunder fading into silence. And perhaps that is why they fascinate us still, because within their story lies the rhythm of history itself, the rise, the glory, the ruin, and the echo that follows. Before we continue this journey into the heart of the forgotten empire, take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe to Empires Historical and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter in our exploration of the world's lost civilizations. Your support helps us bring these buried stories back to life, one empire at a time. Now, prepare yourself. The sands of time are shifting, and the gates of Hattusa, the Lion Gates, are about to open once more. Through them, we will step into a world of thunder and prophecy, of kings who dared to challenge gods, and of a people who believed they could harness the storm itself. This is where the forgotten empire begins. For more than 3,000 years, the empire of the Hittites lay buried beneath the silence of time. Their palaces turned to dust, their gods forgotten, their language dead. The great citadel of Hattusa, once filled with the roar of chariots and the smoke of sacrifices, had become nothing more than a barren plateau, its stones scattered, its temples devoured by the earth itself. For centuries, no one even knew it had existed. And yet, destiny is patient. In the 19th century, as Europe's thirst for ancient truth reached fever pitch, the winds of Anatolia began to whisper again. What they carried would shake the foundations of history. It began in 1834 with a French explorer named Charles Texier. He was not searching for the Hittites. No one was, because no one believed they had ever been real. Texier had set out across the desolate highlands of central Turkey in search of a Roman city called Tavium. What he found instead was something entirely unexpected. Amid the broken hills and juniper trees of a place called Boğazköy, he stumbled upon colossal ruins, massive stone gates flanked by lions carved in relief, walls that stretched across mountainsides, and strange inscriptions unlike any he had seen in Greece, Egypt, or Mesopotamia. The air was thin and silent, as though the place itself had been holding its breath for 3,000 years. In his journals, Texier wrote of his astonishment. These ruins were too grand, too ancient, too alien to belong to Rome. The figures chiseled into the rock wore tall, conical hats, and their garments flowed in ways no Greco-Roman sculptor would have imagined. He had no words for what he had seen. Europe read his report with fascination, but also with disbelief. Some claimed it was Phrygian, others Lydian. A few whispered Assyrian. None were right. The true name of the builders had not been spoken aloud for millennia. Still, Texier had opened the first crack in the wall of forgetting. Decades passed. Empires rose and fell again. The Ottoman sultans permitted only limited expeditions, and Europe's archaeologists turned their attention elsewhere. Egypt's pyramids, Troy's plains, Mesopotamia's ziggurats. Anatolia, harsh and wind-scoured, remained an enigma. But in the early 1900s, a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler decided to follow Texier's forgotten trail. Winkler was a man obsessed with languages and legends. He was convinced that Boğazköy hid the remnants of an empire older than any remembered kingdom of the region. In 1906, under the scorching Anatolian sun, Winkler's team began to dig. The earth gave way reluctantly at first, revealing bits of pottery, fragments of wall, shards of forgotten life. But as they went deeper, the scope of the site unfolded before them. Massive fortifications, a royal citadel, temples built upon terraces, storerooms filled with clay tablets, thousands of tablets, tens of thousands, each etched with the fine wedge-shaped strokes of cuneiform script. At first, the discovery seemed impossible. Cuneiform belonged to Mesopotamia, to Sumer and Babylon, not to the mountains of Anatolia. What was it doing here? The deeper Winkler dug, the more the mystery grew. Over the following months, he and his team unearthed more than 25,000 clay tablets, carefully stacked and baked by time into permanence. They carried royal decrees, prayers to unknown gods, treaties with strange foreign powers, and correspondence between kings whose names had been lost to memory. Boğazköy, it seemed, was not just a city. It was the heart of an empire. The news raced across Europe like wildfire. Scholars debated furiously who had built this city. Some thought it was a northern outpost of the Assyrians. Others speculated it might belong to the Mitanni or to a mysterious people mentioned in Egyptian records, the Keita. But the inscriptions held secrets that none of these theories could explain. In one tablet, Winkler found references to places that sounded eerily familiar. Aleppo, Carchemish, even Kadesh, the city of the great battle against Pharaoh Ramesses II. If these tablets truly mentioned Kadesh, then these people were not peripheral. They had once been rivals of Egypt itself. Still, the script remained a puzzle. Though written in cuneiform, the language beneath it was alien. Scholars could read the symbols, but not the words. They recognized Sumerian determinatives, Akkadian influences, fragments of foreign tongues. Yet something entirely new lurked beneath. For nearly a decade, the tablets sat in European archives, their voices locked away, waiting for someone who could listen. That someone appeared in 1915. His name was Bedřich Hrozný, a Czech linguist and Assyriologist serving in the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War. Amid the chaos of the trenches, he pored over photographs of the tablets from Boğazköy, haunted by their cryptic words. One day, as he studied a particular line, a thought struck him. The sentence read, "Nu ninda an edzateni watarma ekuteni." The words ninda and watar seemed strangely familiar. Ninda was the Sumerian sign for bread, and watar sounded like the German Wasser, water. Could it be? Could these people have spoken an early form of an Indo-European language, the family that would later give birth to Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and English? It was an audacious hypothesis, but as Hrozný tested it, the pieces began to fall into place. He realized the phrase meant, You eat bread and drink water. A simple sentence, yet it shattered centuries of scholarly certainty. For the first time, humanity could hear the voice of a people thought to be utterly lost. Perosny had discovered that the Hittite language, spoken by the rulers of Boaz-Koi, was the oldest known member of the Indo-European family. It predated Homer by 1,000 years, Latin by 2, and English by 3. The Hittites, the mysterious Eta of Egyptian inscriptions, were not myth after all. They had been a mighty empire, equal in power to Egypt and Babylon, and their heart had been Hattusa, the city Texier had found 70 years earlier. The revelation was seismic. It rewrote the map of ancient history. The Near East, long thought to be divided neatly between the Semitic powers of Mesopotamia and the dynasties of Egypt, suddenly had a third axis, a forgotten Indo-European superpower that had stood between them. The Hittites had fought, traded, and negotiated with the giants of their age, only to vanish so completely that the world had erased them. Now, thanks to one explorer's curiosity, one archaeologist's persistence, and one linguist's insight, their story had returned from the grave. In the decades that followed, excavations at Hattusa revealed an empire of astonishing complexity. The tablets uncovered by Winkler turned out to be royal archives, one of the most complete records of Bronze Age governance ever found. They describe laws more humane than those of Hammurabi, rituals of breathtaking beauty, and treaties carved with mutual respect rather than conquest. The very first written peace treaty in history between the Hittite king Hattusili III, Farazar, Ashrainao Smarmo Windas, was among them. What had once been myth was now fact, inscribed in clay. The rediscovery of the Hittites was more than an archaeological triumph. It was a humbling reminder of how fragile memory can be. Entire civilizations, entire languages can vanish beneath a few meters of soil, their names turned to silence, their greatness forgotten. And yet, history has a strange way of remembering. It hides its treasures in plain sight, waiting for the moment when curiosity and courage align to bring them back to light. When we look at the lion gates of Hattusa today, their jaws forever open in stone, we are staring at the threshold between oblivion and remembrance. Behind those gates once stood an empire that rivaled Egypt, traded with Babylon, and dared to call itself the land of 1,000 gods. For 3 millennia, the world forgot them. But thanks to a handful of dreamers, the explorer, the archaeologist, the linguist, the Hittites have spoken again. Their rediscovery is not just a chapter in archaeology, it is a testament to the endurance of truth. No civilization ever truly dies as long as its story is told. And for the Hittites, after thousands of years of silence, their story has only just begun. Long before the name Hittite was ever whispered by human tongues, the central plateau of Anatolia was already ancient. Wind swept across its red earth and granite hills, carving valleys that would one day cradle cities of kings. Rivers like veins of silver threaded the highlands, the Halys, known today as the Kızılırmak, looping like a giant serpent before pouring itself into the Black Sea. The people who lived here in those earliest centuries had no empire, no walls of stone or armies of bronze. They were the HATTI, the first known masters of this rugged land, whose spirits were bound to the mountains, whose gods lived in every tree, every stream, every storm. Archaeologists would later uncover traces of them at sites like Alaka Hoyuk and Eskiyapar, villages of mud brick and timber built atop the bones of even older settlements. Their art shimmered with a strange beauty, golden stags, sun discs, and the images of priestly kings standing before horned deities. Their language, unrelated to any Indo-European or Semitic tongue, was lost to time, but their symbols spoke of a deep reverence for the natural world. The HATTI were a people of the earth, their rituals drenched in the blood of bulls and rams offered to the storm god who commanded the skies above Anatolia. For 1,000 years, they lived in relative peace, their power measured not by conquest, but by trade and faith. Trade, however, is the first whisper of empire. As bronze became the metal of civilization, Anatolia's rich mines of copper drew merchants from far beyond its mountains. From the east came Assyrian traders bearing tin, precious tin without which bronze could not be made. They brought also the script of Sumer, carving their accounts into wet clay with the sharp edge of a reed. Over time, Assyrian merchant colonies, Karum as they called them, sprang up in Hatti lands, the greatest of them at a place named Kanesh, or Nesa. It was here that two worlds met, the pragmatic economy of Mesopotamia and the ancient mysticism of Anatolia. It was here that the seeds of the Hittite state would be sown. But it was not the Hatti themselves who would build that empire. Sometime around 2000 BCE, new tribes began to arrive from the north. They were herdsmen, warriors, and wanderers, Indo-European speakers whose ancestors had roamed the great Eurasian steppe. Whether they crossed through the narrow Bosporus or descended through the Caucasus is still unknown, but they brought with them horses, chariots, and the language that would later evolve into the oldest Indo-European tongue ever recorded. To the Hatti, they must have seemed like spirits of the storm, pale, fierce, and relentless. At first, they settled in small enclaves on the frontier, mingling with the local people, taking Hattian wives, trading with the Assyrian merchants. But as their numbers grew, so too did their ambition. From the city of Kushara, a warrior chieftain named Pythana began to gather strength. His army swept through the valleys of central Anatolia, seizing control of key trade routes and cities. His son, Anita, inherited not only his father's conquests, but his vision. Anita was no mere raider. He was a conqueror with the mind of a ruler. The tablets found at Kanesh speak his name with awe. He called himself Great King, the first in Anatolia to do so. One by one, the cities of the Hatti fell before him. Nesa, Zalpa, and finally Hattusa, the mountain stronghold of the old Hattian kings. When Hattusa resisted, Anita took it by force and cursed it in fury. "Whoever after me shall resettle Hattusa," he wrote. "Let the storm god strike him down." It was an oath of destruction, born of pride and wrath that would echo across the centuries. Ironically, it would be his own descendants who defied that curse and built an empire upon its ashes. Anita's reign marked a turning point in the history of Anatolia. For the first time, the region was ruled not by a coalition of city-states, but by a centralized kingdom. His laws were written, his scribes recorded victories, and his armies marched in the name of a single crown. He was both a bridge and a blade, bridging the old Hattian world with the new Indo-European culture and cutting through the divisions that had once kept Anatolia fragmented. When Anita died, his realm fractured once again, as all young kingdoms do. But his legacy endured in blood and language. From his city of Nesa came the word Nesite, the term the Hittites themselves would later use for their own tongue. Centuries later, around 1650 BCE, a new king rose in those same lands. His name was Labarna, or perhaps it was a title, for his successors would bear it proudly as a mark of divine kingship. Labarna was not content to rule a small kingdom of traders and farmers. He dreamed of empire. Gathering the rival city-states beneath his rule, he re-established his capital at the very place Anita had once cursed, Hattusa. From those heights, surrounded by steep cliffs and snowbound passes, he proclaimed himself ruler of the land of Hatti. The curse was broken and the Hittite kingdom was born. It is easy to imagine that moment, the fires burning on the altars of the storm god, the banners snapping in the mountain wind, the drums echoing across the valley. Labarna's people, descendants of both Indo-European conquerors and native Hatti tribes, now called themselves the people of the land of Hatti. The name Hittite that we use today would come much later, borrowed from the Old Testament's sons of Heth. In their own language, they remained forever bound to the earth they ruled. Labarna's genius lay not only in conquest, but in unity. He understood that empire is not built solely by the sword, but by belief. He absorbed the gods of the Hatti, blending them with those of his Indo-European ancestors. The result was a vast, intricate pantheon where every mountain, river, and storm had its divine voice. Religious tolerance became state policy. Conquered peoples were not forced to abandon their gods, but to share them. This syncretism would later earn the Hittites their epithet, the land of 1,000 gods. To govern his realm, Labarna created a system of vassal states bound to him by oath. Each local ruler swore loyalty to the great king and paid tribute in silver, grain, or soldiers. These oaths were sacred, sealed not only by law, but by divine witness. To break them was not merely treason, it was blasphemy. The Hittites, unlike the crueler empires to come, sought order through balance. They did not annihilate their enemies, but absorbed them, weaving them into the fabric of the state. It was a model of pragmatic power, less brutal than Assyria, less rigid than Egypt, but no less formidable. The early Hittite kings ruled as warrior priests, their authority both political and divine. The great king was the chief priest of the storm god, leading festivals, sacrifices, and rituals that tied heaven and earth together. Beneath him stood a council of nobles known as the Panku, who advised and constrained his rule, a primitive parliament centuries ahead of its time. The law code of these early kings, preserved on clay tablets, reveals a society surprisingly humane. Fines were favored over mutilation. Even slaves had certain rights and could earn freedom. It was a world that valued justice as much as strength. Yet it was not peace that defined the birth of the Hittite state. It was struggle. From the north came the wild Casca tribes, raiding across the mountains. To the south, the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni grew restless, threatening the Hittite trade routes to Syria. But the Hittites endured. Their chariot armies, forged in the crucible of constant warfare, became the envy of the ancient world. Their kings learned diplomacy as deftly as war, sending envoys and marrying princesses into foreign courts. And above it all, the storm god was said to ride with them, his thunder rolling across the battlefield. The story of Hatti's transformation into the Hittite kingdom is not merely one of conquest. It is the story of human adaptation, the merging of old and new, native and foreign, earth and sky. From the ashes of the Hatti and the ambition of the Indo-European settlers arose a civilization unlike any other, disciplined yet spiritual, fierce yet pragmatic, ancient yet startlingly modern. By the time Labarna's successors took the throne, the Hittites were no longer a forgotten people hidden among Anatolian hills. They had become a nation destined to challenge Egypt, to sack Babylon, and to inscribe their name into the first great epic of human history. But like all that is born of ambition and divinity, their rise carried within it the shadow of its fall. The storm god had given them power, and one day he would come to reclaim it. The birth of the old kingdom of the Hittites was not a sudden eruption of power, but the steady forging of a destiny under fire. Around 1650 BCE, amid the swirling rivalries of Anatolia, a single name began to echo across the highlands: Labarna. To his people, he was more than a man. He was the living bridge between gods and mortals, the first ruler to bind the fractured lands of Hatti into one. Where others had ruled as warlords or chieftains, Labarna envisioned something greater. A kingdom that would endure beyond the sword's edge, built upon oath, loyalty, and divine will. From his capital at Hattusa, perched high in the Anatolian plateau, Labarna oversaw the transformation of a scattered collection of city-states into a unified state. The city itself seemed to defy nature. Massive walls coiled like a serpent around its hills. Gates carved with lions and sphinxes guarded its heart. The wind howled through its valleys, carrying with it the sound of hammers striking bronze and priests chanting to the storm god Tarhunt. It was from this austere citadel that the Hittites began to carve their mark upon history. Labarna's rule was marked by campaigns that stretched his dominion far beyond the Central Plains. His armies marched south into the fertile lands of Arzawa, northward against the Kaska tribes, and east toward the trade routes that connected Anatolia to Syria. His conquests were not acts of greed, but of consolidation. He sought not only to expand, but to unify. With each captured city came not destruction, but assimilation. Local princes were spared if they swore loyalty, their gods absorbed into the ever-growing Hittite pantheon. Each new oath bound not just men but deities, weaving divine sanction into the very fabric of empire. But the man who truly embodied the ambitions of the early Hittite state was Labarna's successor, the formidable Hattusili I, the man of Hadassa. He took his name from the city itself, as if to declare that he and the capital were one and the same. Under his reign, the Hittites emerged from the obscurity of Anatolia and strode boldly onto the stage of the Near East. Hattusili was a warrior king, ruthless when necessary, but guided by an almost sacred vision of kingship. He viewed his throne as a divine trust bestowed upon him by the storm god and the sun goddess of Arinna. The chronicles carved on clay tablets recount how, even in his old age, he would stand before the assembled army, hair silvered by years of battle, invoking the gods to witness his deeds. "I have not been careless," he proclaimed in one of his last inscriptions. "I have built cities, I have fought wars, I have made my land strong, I have done what the gods commanded." His campaigns were relentless. To the north, he subdued rebellious mountain tribes. To the south, he crossed the Taurus Mountains and invaded Syria, capturing the cities of Alalak and Aleppo, great centers of the Amorite and Hurrian world. His armies reached as far as the gates of Babylon's northern frontier, striking fear into lands that had once ignored the mountain kingdoms of Anatolia. For the first time, the name of the Hittites was spoken in the same breath as those of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Hattusili's military success, however, came at a terrible cost. The further he expanded, the more fragile his realm became. Distance stretched communication. Loyalty thinned with each newly conquered vassal. His own family was not immune to the rot of ambition. The tablets left behind speak with shocking intimacy of betrayal. His nephew, once his chosen heir, turned against him. The old king, wounded and bitter, dictated his final testament not to his bloodline but to his will. He adopted a grandson, Mursili, and made him heir instead, bypassing treacherous kin. "He is my son," the king declared, chosen by the storm god himself. When Hattusili died, the empire trembled but did not fall. The boy he had chosen grew into the warrior Mursili the Fern, inheriting not only his grandfather's armies, but his unfinished ambitions. If Hattusili had pushed the Hittite frontiers into Syria, Mursili would take them beyond imagination. In one of the most astonishing campaigns of the ancient world, Mursili led his army from Anatolia through the Syrian plains, past Aleppo and the ruins of Mari, all the way to Babylon itself, a journey of more than 1,200 kilometers. Babylon was, at that time, one of the wealthiest and most feared cities on earth. The chronicles of later Assyrian scribes record that the Hittites came like a storm from the north, breaking through its walls and plundering its treasures. Around 1595 BCE, Babylon fell. The Hittites carried off the spoils of empire, gold, grain, captives, and perhaps most importantly, ideas. The fall of Babylon was both triumph and tragedy. It marked the high point of Hittite power in the Old Kingdom, but also the beginning of its unraveling. Mursili, still young, returned home with his armies laden with wealth. But his victory sowed envy among the nobles. He had done the impossible, and for that, he could not be allowed to live long. Soon after his return, he was assassinated in his sleep by his brother-in-law and cupbearer, Hantili. The murder of Mursili plunged the Hittite realm into chaos. Over the next century, the throne became a seat of peril. Kings rose and fell in a whirlwind of betrayal, their reigns measured in seasons rather than years. Brothers killed brothers. Queens plotted against husbands. Generals crowned themselves kings. Each coup weakened the fragile unity that Labarna and Hattusili had so painfully forged. The chronicles from this era read like lamentations. The gods were silent. The land was in disorder. The cities rebelled. And yet, even amid this turmoil, the Hittite state did not disappear. Its institutions, its scribes, its temples, its armies endured. The storm might break the branches, but the roots held fast. The Hittites had built something far stronger than any one king, a system of governance anchored in law and sacred order. Out of bloodshed and betrayal came a reformer whose wisdom would shape the empire for centuries to come, Telepinu. Telepinu's name rarely appears in the annals of conquest, for he was not a warrior in the mold of Hattusili or Mursili. His victories were not won on the battlefield, but in the realm of law and justice. He ascended the throne during one of the darkest chapters of Hittite history, when civil war had bled the kingdom nearly dry. His response was not vengeance, but order. In a remarkable act of statesmanship, Telepinu issued what would later be called the Edict of Telepinu, a document that stands as one of the earliest known attempts to codify royal succession and prevent political violence. It was both confession and constitution. In it, the king recounted the crimes of his forefathers, the murders that had shattered the line of Labarna, and the chaos that had followed. In those days, he wrote, blood was shed in the palace, brother killed brother. The land was ruined. The gods turned their backs upon us. Then, with solemn finality, he declared, let no one, whoever he may be, spill royal blood again. The edict established clear rules for inheritance, defined the powers of the great king, and reaffirmed the sacred duty of the monarch to protect his people. It replaced the arbitrary violence of palace coups with the stability of divine law. Through Telepinu's wisdom, the Hittite kingdom survived its first great reckoning. His reforms did not end ambition, but they contained it. They did not erase betrayal, but they gave it consequence. The storm passed, and from its wake rose the foundations of an empire that would one day stand among the greatest of the ancient world. By 1500 BCE, the Old Kingdom had exhausted itself. Its kings were weary, its armies scattered, its gods perhaps silent. But in the ashes of those turbulent centuries lay the blueprint for endurance. The Hittites had learned what every civilization must. That power without order is fleeting, that conquest without conscience is self-destruction. The Old Kingdom of the Hittites was not their golden age, but it was their crucible. It was here that they learned to govern, to endure, to bind heaven and earth through law as much as through faith. When later generations, Shupalululiuma, Hattusili III, and the queens of empire looked back to their ancestors, they saw not chaos, but origin, not failure, but foundation. Out of the storms of the Old Kingdom, the Hittites had learned how to survive the wrath of gods and men alike. And in that survival, they discovered their destiny. The century that followed the Edict of Telepinu was one of silence, an uneasy stillness in which the Hittite kingdom seemed to fade into shadow. The Old Kingdom had burned bright and violent, its kings remembered for conquest and bloodshed. Now the land of Hatti lingered between memory and oblivion. The tablets grow fewer, the inscriptions less proud. Historians would later call it the Middle Kingdom. But to the Hittites themselves, It must have felt like exile, a long twilight between the first storm and the next dawn. The causes of this decline were many, and none simple. The great unity forged by Labarna and Hattusili had crumbled after Telepinu's death. The royal line fractured into competing branches, each claiming divine sanction. Local governors, once bound by sacred oaths, began to rule their provinces as independent lords. The heartland of Hatti, rocky, cold, and thin-soiled, could no longer sustain the weight of empire. Beyond its borders, new powers were rising. To the north, the wild Kaska tribes pressed relentlessly into Hittite lands, burning farms and ambushing supply trains. They came from the dense forests along the Black Sea, fierce and untamed, worshippers of spirits older than the storm god himself. No fortress could hold them for long. They vanished into the mountains as quickly as they appeared, leaving smoke and ruin behind. To the southeast, an even greater threat emerged, the Mitanni kingdom, a Hurrian-speaking power that dominated northern Mesopotamia and Syria. The Mitanni were horse lords, masters of chariot warfare, their rulers calling themselves Marianu, nobles trained from youth in the art of the bow and the rein. They controlled the fertile plains that once linked Hatti to its southern trade partners. Their influence spread like a shadow, cutting the Hittites off from the lucrative routes of silver and grain that flowed toward the Euphrates. Between the Mitanni in the south and the Kaska in the north, Hatti became a kingdom hemmed in by fire and wilderness. The kings of this era, Huzziya, Zidanta, Amuna, are ghosts in the record. Their names survive only as fragments in later chronicles, often cursed or forgotten. They ruled not from strength, but from necessity, their reigns brief and turbulent. Each inherited a kingdom smaller than his predecessors, yet each struggled to preserve its dignity. The great temples of Hattusa still smoked with incense, but the hymns that once rang with confidence now carried tones of supplication. The priests prayed not for victory, but for survival. Still, the Hittites were nothing if not resilient. The machinery of their civilization endured even as their borders shrank. The scribes continued their work, recording laws, treaties, and omens in the neat, cuneiform script adopted from the Mesopotamians. The bureaucracy of the great king persisted, even when the title itself had lost much of its majesty. Local rulers kept the rituals alive. They still poured libations to the 1,000 gods, still read the stars, still invoked the old oaths of loyalty. Beneath the political decay, the spiritual heart of the Hittite world continued to beat. The Middle Kingdom was, in many ways, a period of introspection. Deprived of outward conquest, the Hittites turned inward, to faith, to ritual, to the codification of their laws and myths. From this era emerged texts that would later form the backbone of Hittite religion: hymns to the sun, goddess of Arena, rituals for the purification of the land, and prayers that reveal a people haunted by the idea of divine displeasure. "We have angered the gods," one tablet laments. "The land is sick. The fields yield no grain. The oxen do not breed. O storm god, forgive us." In these words lies the psychological truth of the age. The Hittites saw their political misfortunes as the mirror of cosmic imbalance. To restore the state, they believed, they must first restore harmony with heaven. This spiritual turn gave rise to a new kind of kingship. The rulers of the Middle Kingdom saw themselves less as conquerors and more as caretakers of divine order. One such figure, Aliwamna, attempted to restore legitimacy by tracing his descent to the line of Telepinu, invoking the edict's authority to stabilize the throne. Others forged marriage alliances to strengthen their claim, yet none possessed the charisma or military genius needed to rebuild the empire. Their reigns were defensive, measured not in victories gained, but in disasters averted. Meanwhile, the world beyond Anatolia was changing. Egypt, recovering from its own internal turmoil, began extending its reach northward. The Mitanni, sensing opportunity, positioned themselves as brokers of power between the great kingdoms. To the west, the rising states of Arzawa and Mira grew rich on trade with the Aegean world. The Hittites, once feared for their chariots and armies, became increasingly isolated. Their envoys no longer carried tribute. They carried pleas for peace. And yet, even in this apparent decline, the Hittites laid foundations for their later resurgence. In these quiet, difficult centuries, they refined the administrative systems that would one day sustain an empire. They perfected their methods of record-keeping and treaty law. The practice of binding vassal states through detailed oaths and reciprocal obligations, so central to their later diplomacy, was honed during this era of weakness. Likewise, the religious syncretism that had begun under Labarna and Hattusili deepened. The Hittites absorbed not only Hattian deities, but Hurrian and Mesopotamian ones, transforming their pantheon into an ever-expanding reflection of the multicultural world they inhabited. It was in this period, too, that the Hittites began to systematize the training of their warriors and horses. Surrounded by enemies who excelled in chariot warfare, they sought to match discipline with science. In the archives of later Hattusa, archaeologists discovered a remarkable text known as the Kikuli Treatise, a manual for training horses that drew on Hurrian techniques and mathematical precision. Though likely compiled later, it reflects innovations that began in the Middle Kingdom. Proof that even in decline, the Hittites were experimenting, adapting, evolving. But the path back to greatness would not come easily. Each generation of kings faced the same relentless cycle: rebellion, invasion, famine. The Casca burned the northern villages again and again. The Mitanni pushed deeper into Anatolia, taking the cities of Alalak and Aleppo, once the jewels of Hattusili's conquests. The old dream of empire seemed dead. Hattusa itself was at times abandoned, its walls overgrown with weeds, its temples silent. The great king's throne stood empty, and in its place sat regents and usurpers, shadows of a vanished glory. And yet, history rarely forgets those who wait. The Middle Kingdom's century of struggle tempered the Hittites like the bronze they forged, heated by adversity, hammered into resilience. When the world finally shifted again, when Mitanni power began to wane under pressure from Assyria and Egypt's expansion reached its limits, the stage was set for the Hittites' return. Out of the confusion of the late 15th century, a new dynasty emerged, descended perhaps from the line of Telepinu, but forged in the crucible of crisis. This new house would restore Hattusa, reforge its walls, and rekindle the old flame of empire. It would produce kings whose names would once again shake the world: Tudalia, Arnuwanda, Supiluliuma. They would reclaim the lands lost to Mitanni, defeat their enemies with discipline and faith, and lead Hatti into its true golden age. But none of that could have happened without the century of darkness that came before. The Middle Kingdom is often dismissed by historians as a forgotten interval, a pause between greatnesses. Yet it was far more than that. It was a time of endurance, when the Hittite spirit was tested and refined. Empires often define themselves not by their triumphs, but by how they survive their trials. The Hittites survived through adaptability, through faith, and through the quiet strength of a civilization unwilling to die. When the chronicles of the New Kingdom begin again, when the tablets speak once more of conquest and diplomacy, they do so in the language preserved and purified by this age of silence. The Middle Kingdom was not a failure. It was preparation. Beneath the ashes of lost wars and forgotten kings, the Hittites learned the hardest lesson of all: that survival itself is a kind of victory. And so, when the thunder of the New Kingdom finally broke across the plateau of Anatolia, it did not come from nowhere. It came from the embers left smoldering in this long twilight. The Hittites had endured their exile. The gods had not abandoned them. The storm was coming again, and this time, they would ride it. Around the middle of the 15th century before our era, the winds that had long howled across the Anatolian plateau began to shift. The silence that had blanketed the Hittite lands for more than a century broke like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Out of a fragmented kingdom of weary kings and forgotten cities emerged a new generation of rulers, men of iron will and divine conviction, who would restore the land of Hatti to glory. What followed was the rebirth of an empire. A resurgence so complete that within 2 centuries the Hittites would stand shoulder to shoulder with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria as one of the great powers of the ancient world. This was the age of the Hittite Empire, the new kingdom, when the storm returned to Anatolia. The man who began that restoration was Tudalia I, whose reign around 1400 BCE marked the turning of the tide. His name, which means beloved of the storm god, symbolized a renewal of faith and destiny. Tudalia was both warrior and reformer. He inherited a kingdom battered by foreign enemies and internal decay, yet he possessed something none of his predecessors had since Hattusili I, a vision of empire. His first act was to reclaim Hattusa, the city once abandoned to ruin. Among its shattered gates and weed-grown streets, he rebuilt the citadel, repaired the temples, and rededicated the capital to Tarhunt, the storm god of heaven. It was a deliberate act of resurrection, a declaration to gods and men alike that Hatti had risen again. Tudalia understood that empire could not rest solely on conquest. To endure, it required a disciplined heart and an educated hand. He reorganized the military, instituting a system that divided his forces into professional standing units supported by local levies. The chariot corps, long the pride of Hittite warfare, became the centerpiece of this new army. In later archives, scribes would preserve the Kikuli text, a manual on horse training written by a Hurrian master in Tudalia's service. It described interval conditioning, diet, and rest schedules for war horses with scientific precision, evidence of a civilization not content with strength alone, but devoted to mastery. The Hittite chariot, heavier and more stable than those of Egypt or Mitanni, carried 3 warriors, a driver, a shield-bearer, and an archer. Together they formed the unstoppable engine of the Hittite army, a storm given form. While Tudalia restored order at home, the world beyond Anatolia was transforming. The Mitanni, who had once dominated northern Syria, began to wane, their vassals restless and their rivals encroaching. The Egyptians under Thutmose III and Amenhotep II extended their influence deep into Canaan, clashing with Mitanni for supremacy. Caught between these powers, Tudalia seized his moment. Through diplomacy and warfare, he expanded Hittite control southward, reclaiming key cities like Aleppo and Carchemish. By the end of his reign, the Hittites were once again a force to be reckoned with, a kingdom reborn from ruin, poised to dominate the crossroads of empires. But it was Shuppiluliuma I, Tudhalia's successor, who would lift Hatti to its zenith. His reign was one of audacity and brilliance, marked by strategic genius that reshaped the political landscape of the Near East. Shuppiluliuma, often called the Great Restorer, was both conqueror and statesman, a man whose ambitions stretched from the Aegean to the Euphrates. He ascended the throne amid uncertainty, as rival claimants challenged his legitimacy. Yet within a few years, he had crushed his enemies and unified the realm under his banner. Shuppiluliuma moved swiftly and decisively. He recognized that the Mitanni were the key to dominance in the south. Their empire was faltering under the weight of Assyrian attacks and internal dissent. In a series of campaigns executed with ruthless efficiency, Shuppiluliuma dismantled Mitanni power piece by piece. He allied with disaffected vassals, offered treaties to the wavering, and annihilated those who resisted. City after city fell. Washukani, Kadesh, Ugarit, each absorbed into the expanding Hittite sphere. When the dust settled, the Mitanni Empire was gone, and Hatti had replaced it as master of northern Syria. Yet Shupiluluma's triumphs were not only military. He understood that conquest without legitimacy breeds rebellion. To secure his empire, he established a network of vassal states governed by loyal kings, often members of his own family, bound to him by elaborate treaties. These agreements, inscribed on clay tablets, set out mutual obligations in precise, almost legal language. The vassal swore loyalty, paid tribute, and provided troops, while the great king pledged protection and recognition. They were sealed not by signatures, but by oaths before the gods. To violate such an oath was to invite divine destruction. This system became the backbone of the Hittite imperial order, an intricate web of faith, law, and power. At home, Shupiluluuma transformed Hattissa into one of the most imposing capitals of the ancient world. The city expanded across the hills, its walls stretching for kilometers, punctuated by monumental gates carved with lions, sphinxes, and divine guardians. Within its walls stood vast palaces, administrative archives, and the great temple of the storm god and sun goddess, twin deities who embodied the balance of heaven and earth. Hattusa was not merely a seat of power, it was a statement of identity. To walk its streets was to feel the pulse of an empire whose gods numbered in the thousands and whose reach spanned continents. The Hittites' religious world mirrored their political one, complex, layered, and inclusive. Their empire encompassed dozens of cultures and languages, and rather than impose a single faith, they absorbed them all. The Hittite king served as high priest, performing rituals to the gods of every conquered land. Their pantheon became so vast that later scribes called it the land of 1,000 gods. This syncretism was not weakness, but wisdom. In honoring every deity, the Hittites united their empire through shared reverence. In their temples, the gods of Hurrians, Hatti, and Luwians stood side by side, a divine parliament presiding over the fate of men. Shupiluluma's power reached its peak when even Egypt, long the Hittites' rival, recognized Hatti's might. After the death of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, the widowed queen, Ankhesenamun, sent a desperate letter to Shupiluluuma, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her and become pharaoh. She wrote, "My husband is dead, and I have no son. They say you have many sons. Send me one, and he shall be my husband, and never will I take one of my servants as husband." It was an extraordinary request, a foreign queen inviting a Hittite prince to take the throne of Egypt. Shupiluluuma hesitated, then agreed, sending his son Zananza south. The journey would end in tragedy. The prince was murdered en route, almost certainly by forces loyal to the Egyptian regent Ai. The insult enraged Shupiluluuma. In vengeance, he invaded Egyptian vassal territories in Syria, capturing Amuru and further expanding Hittite control. But fate had turned. Among the prisoners brought back from these campaigns was a deadly enemy unseen: plague. Within years, it swept through Hattusa, killing thousands, including the great king himself. Shupiluluuma's death was the beginning of a long reckoning. His sons inherited an empire vast but strained. The line of succession passed to Mursili II, a young and untested ruler who faced rebellion on every border. Yet against all odds, he proved himself worthy of his father's legacy. His reign combined courage with conscience. The prayers he left behind reveal a man tormented by the suffering of his people and the wrath of the gods. "I have sinned before you, O storm god," he wrote. "Let the plague end. Let my people live." Under Mursili, the Hittite army reconquered the rebellious Arzawa in the west and repelled Casca incursions in the north. The empire survived its crisis, and with it, its moral core. The Hittite Empire reached its final and most dazzling form under Mursili II, and his brother Hattusili III whose reigns brought it into direct confrontation with the most powerful empire of their age, Egypt under Ramesses II C. Ang Twei Sekru. The clash came at Kadesh, on the banks of the Orontes River in 1274 BCE. There, tens of thousands of soldiers met in one of the largest chariot battles the world had ever seen. Muwatalli's forces struck first, launching a surprise assault that nearly annihilated the Egyptian vanguard. Ramesses himself barely escaped, rallying his troops only through desperate heroism. Though Egypt claimed victory in its inscriptions, the truth was more complex. Strategically, Kadesh remained in Hittite hands. The battle was a stalemate, but politically it confirmed the Hittites as Egypt's equal. No longer were they the forgotten mountain people of Anatolia. They were now the other great pole of the civilized world. The decades that followed saw peace and prosperity. Under Hattusili III and his queen Puduhepa, a woman of profound intellect and faith, the Hittite Empire reached a level of cultural and diplomatic sophistication unmatched in its history. Puduhepa corresponded directly with Nefertari, the wife of Ramesses II, in letters that spoke not of rivalry, but of sisterhood. The peace treaty signed between Hattusili and Ramesses, etched in both Akkadian and Egyptian, became the first recorded international treaty in history. Its clauses were practical, its tone dignified. "Let there be peace and brotherhood between us, forever," it proclaimed. Copies of the treaty would later adorn the walls of Egyptian temples and, millennia later, the headquarters of the United Nations. By the end of the 13th century BCE, the Hittite Empire stretched from the Aegean to the Euphrates, from the Black Sea to the deserts of Canaan. Its kings ruled through law, faith, and diplomacy. Its cities thrived with trade and culture. Its armies commanded the respect of all who faced them. Yet beneath the splendor, shadows gathered. Famine, internal unrest, and the stirrings of foreign invaders whispered of the storm to come. For now, though, the Hittites stood at the height of their power, an empire of stone and spirit, born from fire, tempered by faith, and bound by the eternal thunder of their gods. The storm had returned, and for a fleeting glorious century it belonged to them. Long before Homer sang of Achilles and the fall of Troy, before Greek poets wove their verses of rage and ruin, the people of Hatti already knew of a city by the sea, a shining fortress at the edge of the world called Wilusa. To the Hittites it was not myth but geography, not legend but policy. It stood where Anatolia met the waters of the Aegean, a frontier between their realm and the mysterious western kingdoms they called AHHIYAWA. What would later become the stuff of epic, the pride of kings, the theft of a woman, the burning of a city, was for them a matter of treaties, wars, and letters. Yet in those fragile clay tablets, buried for millennia, one can sense the pulse of what would one day become myth. The first mention of AHHIYAWA appears in the diplomatic archives of the Hittite Empire during the reigns of the Tudhalias and Mersilis in the 13th century BCE. The scribes of Hattusa, meticulous and pragmatic, wrote the name as though it were obvious, a kingdom well known to all. But to us, it rings like an echo of another world. The word AHHIYAWA bears a haunting resemblance to the term Achaioi, the name Homer gives to the Greeks. If that connection is true, and most scholars today believe it is, then the Hittites were in correspondence with the ancestors of the Mycenaean Greeks, centuries before the Trojan War was immortalized in verse. The AHHIYAWA were powerful, seafaring, and ambitious. Their palaces gleamed with bronze and gold, their kings ruled from citadels like Mycenae and Tiryns. Their fleets roamed the Aegean as far as Cyprus and Anatolia. To the Hittites, they were both distant and dangerously close, a rival power whose reach extended to the very shores of Asia Minor. Between them lay a cluster of small but wealthy kingdoms: Arzawa, Mira, Seha Riverland, and at the very edge of it all, Wilusa, the city the Greeks would later call Troy. The Hittites and the people of AHHIYAWA met not as strangers, but as neighbors across the sea. And, like all neighbors, they oscillated between friendship and hostility. The Hittite tablets record alliances sealed by oaths, trade agreements, and shared interests in quelling rebellion. But they also speak of wars fought over influence and honor. The correspondence between the great king of HATTI and the king of AHHIYAWA reads like a drama in miniature. Formal greetings, polite rebukes, veiled threats, and appeals to ancient friendship. "Why do you trouble my lands?" one king writes. "Have we not sworn peace between us?" The other replies, "My men do not raid your subjects. Perhaps your subjects have wronged mine." Beneath the diplomatic courtesies lies the same combustible mix of pride, ambition, and suspicion that would one day ignite the imagination of poets. The most famous of these letters, the Tawagalawa letter, comes from the reign of Hattusili III, around 1250 BCE. In it, the great king of HATTI writes to his counterpart in AHHIYAWA regarding a certain Piyamaradu, a rebel and troublemaker who had stirred unrest along the Aegean coast. The letter is extraordinary, not just for its content, but for its tone. The Hittite king refers to the king of AHHIYAWA as "my brother," a title reserved only for equals, used in correspondence with the pharaoh of Egypt or the king of Babylon. It implies that the AHHIYAWA were not mere raiders, but a recognized great power, worthy of respect. The two rulers discuss Piyamaradu's transgressions and their mutual interest in peace, but between the lines, one senses tension, accusations of interference, the fragile dance of diplomacy masking deeper rivalry. And then comes the line that has haunted historians for a century. The Hittite king refers, almost in passing, to the matter concerning Wilusa, about which we were at odds. The phrase is brief, almost casual, yet it opens a chasm of speculation. What was this matter? A territorial dispute? A rebellion? A war? We may never know. But if Wilusa truly corresponds to the Greek Ilios, the very name Homer gives to Troy, then this obscure Hittite document may be the oldest record of the Trojan War, or of an event that inspired it. Imagine the scene as it might have been. The city of Wilusa, perched upon the windswept hill of Hizarlik, overlooking the Dardanelles. Its towers gleamed in the sun, its gates carved with lions. Traders from the Aegean and the Black Sea met in its harbors, exchanging tin, wine, and amber. The city was rich not only in gold, but in location. It controlled the passage between two worlds. To the Hittites, it was a crucial vassal state, the western gate of their empire. To the AHHIYAWA, it was a tempting prize, the key to controlling trade between East and West. The struggle for Wilusa was not born of love or vengeance, but of power. Yet in the memory of poets, it would take the shape of passion and pride. Perhaps there was no single war, but a series of skirmishes, conflicts over succession, alliances, and tribute. The Hittite archives suggest that Wilusa was at times loyal to HATTI, at others rebellious, perhaps with AHHIYAWA's support. There are hints of sieges, of envoys dispatched, of treaties renewed under duress. One text records a king of Wilusa named Alexandru, a name strikingly similar to Alexandros, the Greek name for Paris, the Prince of Troy. Another mentions a ruler of AHHIYAWA, whose name is lost, but whose deeds troubled the western frontier of HATTI. Between these fragments, history flickers like torchlight on wet stone. Centuries later, when the 13th century before our era was a time of uneasy splendor. Across the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean, the great kingdoms of the Bronze Age, Egypt, Mycenae, Babylon, and HATTI, stood like pillars supporting a world that had endured for centuries. Trade routes stretched from the Nile to the Aegean, from the Levant to Mesopotamia. Ships laden with copper, tin, and luxury goods crossed calm seas under sails the color of clay. Kings exchanged letters sealed with golden discs, calling each other brother, as though the balance of power among them were eternal. Yet beneath the surface, the ground was already trembling. The age of bronze had reached its breaking point, and the Hittite Empire, perched at the heart of it, would be the first to feel the storm. The first signs were subtle. A poor harvest here, a rebellion there, merchants delayed on the mountain roads, but to the watchful, the omens were unmistakable. In the archives of Hattusa, clay tablets record appeals from vassal kings pleading for grain. "My fields yield nothing," writes one ruler. "My people starve. Send us barley, O great king, lest the land perish." At first, these cries were answered. The empire's storehouses in Anatolia and Syria still brimmed with grain. Its bureaucrats dispatched convoys of carts southward to sustain its allies. Yet the pleas multiplied, spreading across the map like cracks in glass. Drought had come, long and relentless, a slow suffocation that shriveled the fertility of the earth. Tree rings and pollen cores from Anatolia confirm what the ancients already knew. The rains had failed. Famine alone, however, does not fell an empire. The Hittites had endured lean years before. What made this different was that the very fabric of their interconnected world began to unravel. The Bronze Age had bound its kingdoms together in prosperity and dependence. Tin from Afghanistan mixed with Cypriot copper to make bronze. Egyptian grain fed Syrian cities. Hittite horses pulled Mycenaean chariots. The collapse of one node sent shockwaves through all the rest. When drought struck Anatolia, trade faltered. When trade faltered, armies could no longer be paid or supplied. When the armies weakened, the borders began to bleed. The enemies of Hatti had been waiting. To the north, the Kaska tribes, those wild, forest-dwelling raiders who had plagued the Hittites for centuries, descended from the mountains once more. They burned fields and villages, cutting off the capital's access to the Black Sea. To the west, the restless kingdoms of Arzawa and Mira grew bolder, sensing weakness in the imperial heart. In the south, the great cities of Syria, Carchemish, Aleppo, Ugarit, struggled to hold their allegiance between Hatti and Egypt. The empire that had once commanded obedience now begged for it. Meanwhile, from the horizon of the sea came a new terror. They appeared first as rumors, ships with curved prows, filled with warriors from lands unknown, descending upon the coasts like a storm. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. Their origins remain a mystery, perhaps displaced Mycenaeans, perhaps desperate refugees from lands already ruined by famine and war. To those who faced them, it mattered little. They were the embodiment of chaos, burning, looting, and vanishing like smoke. In the surviving correspondence between the kings of Ugarit and their Hittite overlords, the desperation is palpable. "The enemy ships have arrived," one letter reads. "They have set fire to my cities and laid waste to my land. My father, the great king, send me troops quickly. They have reached the coast of my kingdom." There is no answer. The next layer of archaeology at Ugarit is ash. Within Hatti, the great king fought not only invaders, but time itself. The royal archives still functioned, but their tone had changed. Gone were the confident decrees of Shuppiluliuma or Hattusili. In their place are prayers, omens, and lists of provisions. The high priests recorded earthquakes that shattered temples and fortresses, signs of divine wrath. The earth shook, the walls fell, the gods turned their faces away, one fragment laments. The Hittites, who had once called themselves the people of 1,000 gods, now feared that none of them were listening. As the crisis deepened, the imperial center began to fracture. Regional governors, cut off from Hattusa, ruled as they saw fit. Some turned to local cults for protection. Others forged alliances with rival states. The royal family itself splintered under the strain. The last great kings, possibly Shupiluliyuma II, the grandson of Hattusili III, faced the impossible task of holding together an empire that was dying on every front. He waged naval battles off the coast of Cyprus, desperate attempts to defend the trade routes that fed the empire's heart. His victories, if they can be called that, were Pyrrhic. Each triumph bought only another year of survival. By around 1200 BCE, the storm broke in full. Across the Near East, cities burned, Mycenae and Tiryns fell in Greece, Ugarit and Alalak vanished from the Levant. Egypt itself fought for its life at the mouths of the Nile, and in the Anatolian highlands, Hattusa, the once great capital of the Hittites, was engulfed by fire. Archaeologists found its ruins layered with soot and charcoal, its colossal gates toppled, its archives baked to permanence by the heat that destroyed them. No human record tells of its final hours, but one can imagine the scene. The wind carrying the smell of smoke, the clang of weapons in the streets, the priests dragging sacred statues into the temples as the walls trembled. The gods of Hatti, it seemed, had departed. The fall of Hattusa did not end the story immediately. In the aftermath of the capital's destruction, fragments of the empire endured in the south. The city of Carchemish, on the banks of the Euphrates, became the seat of a new dynasty descended from the Hittite royal line. From there, and from other enclaves, Melid, Kumu, Gurgum, emerged the so-called Neo-Hittite kingdoms, Yaros, small yet resilient, preserving the language, art, and religion of their forebears. For a time, they carried the flame of Hatti through the darkness that followed. But the age that had birthed the Hittite Empire was gone forever. The old trade routes lay in ruins. The bronze furnaces cold. The Iron Age had begun. What destroyed the Hittites was not a single blow, but a convergence, a perfect storm of environmental collapse, invasion, and internal exhaustion. Drought stripped their fields, famine weakened their armies, earthquakes shattered their fortresses, and waves of displaced peoples pressed in from every direction. Yet it was not merely physical destruction that doomed them. It was the loss of faith in order itself. The world of the Hittites had been built on reciprocity, between king and vassal, god and worshipper, earth and sky. When that balance broke, the empire's soul unraveled. There is a haunting symmetry to their end. The Hittites had once risen by mastering the forces of chaos, storm, thunder, conquest, and by binding them into the service of law. In their fall, those same forces returned unbound. The storms they had worshipped became literal, tearing down their cities. The gods of the sky, once invoked to secure victory, became silent witnesses to ruin. The empire that had prided itself on being the land of the thousand gods died not in battle, but in abandonment. And yet, in another sense, they never truly vanished. Their language, etched into thousands of clay tablets, survived, waiting patiently beneath the soil until rediscovered 3 millennia later. Their laws, favoring justice over cruelty, influenced the legal codes of the civilizations that followed. Their treaties, carved in Akkadian and Hittite, became the prototypes for diplomacy itself. The very idea of an international order, bound by mutual respect and divine witness, was their gift to history. When we speak of the end of the Bronze Age, we speak not only of destruction, but of transformation. The fire that consumed Hattusa also forged the world that would come after. The Iron Age empires, Assyria, Persia, Greece, would rise upon the bones of the Hittites, inheriting their innovations even as they forgot their names. But deep beneath the hills of central Turkey, in the quiet ruins of their lost capital, the essence of Hatti remains. The lions still guard their gates, the tablets still bear the words of their kings, and the wind, moving through the empty valleys, still carries the faint echo of their prayers. Thus ended the Hittite Empire, not with a single cry, but with the long sigh of a world passing away. The storm that had given them life had come to claim them, as it always does. Yet, in the silence that followed, their legacy endured, whispering across the centuries that even in destruction there can be remembrance, and that no civilization, however mighty, is ever truly lost as long as the earth remembers its name. When the fires that consumed Hattusa finally faded, and the winds of Anatolia swept the ashes into silence, it might have seemed that the people of Hatti were gone forever, their gods abandoned, their cities in ruin, their name erased from memory. Yet the story of the Hittites did not end with destruction. What perished in the flames of 1200 BCE was not their spirit, but their form. From the ruins of their empire rose echoes that would travel across centuries. Echoes in language, in law, in art, in the very idea of civilization itself. Their stones crumbled, but their voice, pressed into clay, endured. And though they vanished from human memory for 3,000 years, when that voice was finally heard again, it spoke not only of a lost empire, but of what it means to build and to remember. In the aftermath of collapse, the surviving princes and generals of Hatti retreated southward. They found refuge in the lands that had once been the empire's frontier: Carchemish, Melid, Kumu, Tabal. These cities, spared from total ruin, became the seeds of what we now call the Neo-Hittite kingdoms. Small in size but mighty in resilience, they preserved the flame of Hittite culture through the centuries of darkness that followed the fall of the Bronze Age world. Their kings still called themselves great, their scribes still wrote in cuneiform, and their temples still echoed with hymns to the storm god and the sun goddess of Arina. They spoke the language of their ancestors, though it began to blend with Aramaic and Luwian dialects. Even as they adapted to the new Iron Age realities, they carried with them the ancient conviction that order, law, and the favor of the gods were bound together. At Carchemish, once a key stronghold of the empire, the old Hittite administration continued almost unchanged. The city's rulers traced their lineage directly to the royal house of Hattusa, perhaps even to Shupoluliuma himself. They rebuilt the citadel and erected stone reliefs showing kings in the same posture as their imperial forebears, arms raised to the heavens, offerings extended to the divine. But something in the art had shifted. Where the old kingdom's reliefs had been austere and formal, these new carvings carried a strange tenderness. Kings clasping their children's hands, gods smiling with human calm. The trauma of the empire's end had softened the edges of its power, transforming imperial grandeur into human remembrance. The Neo-Hittite states endured for nearly 4 centuries, longer than the empire itself. They traded with the rising powers of Assyria and Phoenicia, acting as cultural bridges between East and West. Their craftsmen influenced the metalwork of the early Iron Age, their scribes advised foreign courts, and their religious iconography, winged beings, lions, bulls, the sacred tree, spread across the Levant. When the Assyrians finally conquered Carchemish in the 8th century BCE, they did not annihilate its culture, but absorbed it. In the palaces of Nineveh and Nimrud, one can still trace the lines of Hittite art in the reliefs of Assyrian kings. The winged guardian spirits that flanked Assyrian gates were descendants of the same divine beings that had once guarded the walls of Hattusa. Even in conquest, the Hittites had the last word. They transformed their conquerors. But the deeper legacy of Hatti lay not in stone or bronze, but in the written word. When Bedřich Hrozný deciphered the Hittite tablets in 1915, he did not merely uncover a lost language, he unveiled the oldest chapter of the Indo-European family, the linguistic ancestor of Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and English. The Hittites had spoken the earliest recorded form of that immense linguistic tree, whose branches would one day shade half the world. Through them, we heard not only the beginnings of empire, but the beginnings of our own tongues, the grammar of myth, law, and story that still shapes the way we think. The Hittite word for king, Labarna, for god, Sias, for bread, Ninda, echoes faintly in the ancient vocabularies that would become our own. Every time we speak of law, of justice, of heaven and earth, we repeat in different voices the ideas that once filled the halls of Hadassah. Their political legacy is no less profound. Among the clay archives of Hadassah, archaeologists found not only chronicles of kings, but legal codes and treaties that reveal a moral sophistication rare for their time. The Hittite law code, inscribed centuries before the laws of Greece or Rome, stands out for its humanity. Where the Babylonians of Hammurabi's age punished crime with mutilation, the Hittites preferred restitution. If a man steals a sheep, he shall restore 4, reads one tablet. If he injures a man, he shall pay compensation. It was a vision of justice rooted not in fear, but in balance. A belief that order could be maintained through fairness rather than terror. The Edict of Telepinu, written in the kingdom's earliest days, became more than a reform decree. It was a philosophy of governance, asserting that kingship was sacred trust, not divine entitlement. In that idea lay the seed of constitutional law itself. And then there was diplomacy, the art of peace. Long before modern nations forged alliances and treaties, the Hittites had already mastered the concept. The Treaty of Kadesh, signed between Pharaoh Rameses II and King Hattusili III around 1259 BCE, remains the earliest surviving international treaty in human history. Its clauses could be read today without revision. Mutual defense, extradition of fugitives, and the establishment of brotherhood forever between two great powers. The text ends with an oath to the gods, binding both sides not through fear of armies, but through the sanctity of promises. A copy of that treaty now hangs on the walls of the United Nations headquarters in New York, a silent testament to the endurance of Hittite statecraft. The empire that fell in flames thus lives on in the idea of peace through law. Spiritually, too, the Hittites left a deep imprint. Their pantheon, vast, inclusive, and syncretic, embodied a theology of coexistence. In a world often defined by religious exclusivity, they offered a model of divine plurality. The Hittites believed that every people, every mountain, every river had its own god, and that all gods were worthy of respect. When they conquered new lands, they built temples for the local deities instead of destroying them. They did not erase, they absorbed. This tolerance, born of pragmatism and reverence alike, allowed them to govern an empire of many tongues and faiths. It also foreshadowed the cultural mosaics that would later define the classical and medieval worlds. In their vision of heaven, there was room for all. Even their understanding of humanity feels startlingly modern. The Hittite prayers and rituals discovered among the tablets reveal a people profoundly aware of moral responsibility. Kings confess sins not only of action, but of intention. Priests plead for mercy not only for their nation, but for themselves. In one of the most poignant texts, a king laments, "O my gods, I have sinned and do not know my sin. My heart is troubled. Forgive me, that my land may be whole again." This is not the cold fatalism of ancient religion, but something intimate and introspective, a voice that still resonates with us. When modern archaeologists uncovered Hattus's ruins in the early 20th century, they found not a city of ghosts, but of memory. The Lion Gate still stood, its twin sentinels guarding the silence. The great temple's courtyards were strewn with fragments of ritual vessels and votive statues. The archives, buried and baked by fire, had preserved the thoughts of an entire civilization. Each tablet was a heartbeat from 3,000 years ago, pulsing faintly beneath the dust. Through them, we rediscovered not only the Hittites, but something about ourselves. That the drive to create order, to seek meaning, to bind faith to justice, is as old as civilization itself. Today, in the modern Turkish province of Hatay, the echo of their name survives. Streets, mountains, and valleys still carry the syllables of HATTI, like faint footprints left by time. Local myths tell of thunder gods and lion guardians, unaware that these are the remnants of a Bronze Age memory. In the museums of Ankara and Istanbul, the artifacts of the Hittites, Tablets, seals, and sculptures glow under glass, their silence more eloquent than any speech. The Hittites remind us that history is not a straight line of progress, but a cycle of creation, loss, and rediscovery. They rose from obscurity, built one of the world's first true empires, and then vanished so completely that for 3,000 years, no one even remembered their name. And yet, when they were finally found again, their voice spoke with startling clarity. As though no time had passed at all, their rediscovery in the modern age was not merely an archaeological event. It was a moral one. It forced humanity to reckon with the fragility of memory and the endurance of culture. Every civilization, no matter how mighty, faces the same choice: to vanish utterly or to leave behind something that can speak when its walls have fallen. The Hittites chose to write. They wrote their laws, their treaties, their prayers, their doubts. They pressed them into clay, trusting that someday someone would listen. And we did. Their empire may have fallen to dust, but their words endure, patient, steadfast, eternal. The echo of Hatti still moves in the wind over the Anatolian hills, whispering the oldest of lessons: that no civilization truly dies as long as its story is told, and that even from the ashes of silence, the voice of humanity will always find its way back to light. History remembers its empires the way the sea remembers the ships that once crossed it, not by their sails or their names, but by the faint patterns they left in the tides. The Hittite Empire, born from the winds and storms of the Anatolian highlands, was one such ship, a vessel of power, faith, and intellect that sailed across the vast ocean of the Bronze Age. For nearly 4 centuries, it stood among the giants of its time, equal to Egypt, Babylon, and Mycenae, shaping the world through its laws, treaties, and theology. And then, as if swallowed by the very gods it had worshipped, it vanished. Yet in its disappearance, the Hittite world did not end. It transformed. Like molten bronze cooled and reshaped, it became part of everything that followed, the unseen metal within the blade of civilization itself. The story of the Hittites is not merely the story of a nation's rise and fall. It is the story of how human beings seek order in chaos, meaning in impermanence. Their empire emerged from the crucible of conflict, flourished through faith and reason, and collapsed under the weight of the same natural and political forces that consume all things. Yet even in its ruin, the Hittite world became the seedbed of what we now call the modern mind, a mind that remembers, questions, and rebuilds. When we gaze at the ruins of Hattusa today, standing silent among the windswept hills of central Turkey, we see more than the remains of walls and temples. We see a mirror held up to the human condition. The Lion Gate still guards the emptiness where once a city of 50,000 lived, prayed, and ruled. The great temple's foundations still mark the spot where kings once offered sacrifices to the gods of storm and sun. The streets that once echoed with chariots and hymns now whisper with the sound of the wind through grass. And yet, there is something deeply alive about that silence. It is the sound of memory itself, patient, enduring, unbroken. To stand in Hattusa is to stand at the boundary between the known and the forgotten. The stones there do not mourn. They remind. They remind us that civilization is not a monument, but a rhythm. Rise, decay, rebirth. The Hittites were not the first to fall, nor the last. Sumer had fallen before them. Greece, Rome, and countless others would follow, but in every collapse lies a continuity that no ruin can erase: the transmission of ideas. The Hittites taught that strength without justice leads to ruin, that law must temper the sword, that faith must coexist with tolerance. These principles, buried in their tablets, would later re-emerge in the philosophies and polities of the classical world, long after their name had faded from memory. Their rediscovery in the 20th century was not simply an archaeological triumph, it was a resurrection of voice. When Bedřich Hrozný read those first deciphered words, "You eat bread and drink water," the past itself seemed to breathe again. The Hittites had been silent for 3 millennia, yet their words emerged as if no time had passed at all. In that moment, humanity was confronted with its own continuity. The forgotten and the living were joined across the gulf of history, and the truth became inescapable. What we lose is never truly lost. It merely waits for us to remember. The fall of the Hittite Empire around 1200 BCE was part of a far greater cataclysm, the collapse of the Bronze Age world. From Greece to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to Anatolia, the lights of civilization dimmed almost simultaneously. Drought, famine, earthquakes, and invasion shattered the networks that had bound empires together. It was, in every sense, the end of an age. But endings are not voids. The Iron Age that followed was not born from nothing. It was forged from the embers of what came before. The knowledge preserved by the Hittites, their writing, metallurgy, and law, became the foundations on which later civilizations stood. Theirs was the bridge that carried humanity across the abyss of collapse. What makes their story so moving is not their power, but their humanity. The Hittite kings were not gods masquerading as men. They were men trying to speak with gods. Their prayers revealed doubt, sorrow, humility, the same emotional landscape that defines us today. They feared failure, longed for forgiveness, and sought meaning in an unpredictable world. "I have sinned," one king confessed, "and do not know my sin." It is a line that could have been written by any of us, in any age. Through such words, the Hittites remind us that history is not made by abstractions or forces, but by human beings caught between the limits of the earth and the demands of heaven. To speak of their legacy, then, is to speak of continuity disguised as loss. The Hittites vanished from memory, yet the echoes of their thought, law as covenant, power as responsibility, the divine as plural, continued to shape the centuries that followed. Their system of treaties prefigured international diplomacy. Their balanced justice foreshadowed later legal codes. Their tolerance of many gods anticipated the cosmopolitanism of later empires. Even their notion of kingship, as both sacred and accountable, would resurface in the philosophies of governance from Mesopotamia to Rome. But beyond politics and religion, there is something almost poetic in their survival. The Hittites were masters of transformation. They took from the Hatti, the Hurrians, and the Mesopotamians, blending languages and beliefs into something uniquely their own. They were not a people of purity, but of synthesis, and it was precisely this ability to adapt that made their culture so resilient. When the empire fell, that spirit did not die. It dispersed, like pollen carried on the wind, seeding the cultures of the Near East with fragments of Hittite thought. In that sense, their greatest achievement was not the empire they built, but the world they helped imagine. We live today in an age of rediscovery, one that mirrors their own. Just as the Hittites sought to reconcile the many gods of their world into harmony, we now struggle to reconcile the many voices of ours. Nations, faiths, identities. Their example speaks to us not as an artifact of the past, but as a lesson for the future. They teach us that strength without empathy breeds isolation, that faith without tolerance breeds destruction, and that the only true immortality lies in understanding. In the quiet ruins of Hattusa, as twilight falls over the Anatolian hills, one can still feel their presence. The stones seem to hum faintly in the cooling air. Somewhere beneath the soil lie thousands of tablets, yet unread, still whispering the thoughts of kings, priests, and scribes. Perhaps one day those voices will rise again, adding new verses to the long song of human history. Until then, the Hittites wait, not as ghosts, but as memory. The story of Hatti began with storms and ended with silence. But silence, too, is part of the storm. It is the pause between thunderclaps, the breath the world takes before speaking again. The Hittites were born from that rhythm, and in their death, they returned to it. They remind us that history is not a linear path, but a spiral. Every fall a return, every ruin a seed. When we speak of the Bronze Age, we often think of metal, of war, of gods and kings. But what endures from that age is not the bronze itself, it is the fire that shaped it, the human will to create, to understand, to leave something behind. The Hittites understood that truth. They carved their prayers into stone, not for immortality, but for remembrance, and in that act, they achieved both. From the ashes of their world, a new age began. The Iron Age dawned not as a rejection of the bronze, but as its child, carrying within it all that had been learned, all that had been lost, all that would one day be rediscovered. The Hittites' empire may have fallen, but their vision, that law can bind the strong, that peace can be made sacred, that the divine can dwell in every voice, endures. In the end, perhaps this is the truest legacy of Hatti, that civilizations die, but humanity persists. The storms will always come, and the fires will always burn, but somewhere amid the ruin, someone will write, on clay, on paper, on memory, and the story will continue. From the ashes of the Bronze Age, from the silence of forgotten kings, the Hittites still speak. And their whisper carries the oldest of human truths, that to build, to believe, and to remember is to defy the gods themselves. The Lost Empire of the Hittites. Secrets of the Bronze Age Superpower.